James "Smokey" Clarke and Liam "Blaze" Donovan were the names that haunted Manchester's streets for months. Armed with stolen cars, homemade explosives, and a ruthless hunger for cash, they turned quiet neighborhoods into war zones. No ATM was safe, no business untouchable, and the city soon learned that fear had a name, and it was the 60-pound. The night was silent, with only the faint hum of distant traffic echoing through the empty streets of Manchester. It was past midnight when most of the city was asleep, and the only movement came from the occasional fox darting across the road. At first glance, it seemed like just another quiet night in a quiet neighborhood. But in the shadows, a crew of masked men were already in motion. A stolen Audi, its plates swapped and its engine tuned for speed, tore down the road before coming to a sudden halt outside a small convenience store. The shop's lights were off, the shutters pulled down, and the street cameras too far away to clearly capture what was about to unfold. The men moved quickly, each with a role. One jumped out with a heavy crowbar, smashing the lock on the shop's entrance, while another pulled equipment from the boot. The third remained inside the car, engine running, eyes fixed on the mirrors for any sign of flashing lights. Within seconds, the ATM at the front of the shop became their target. They worked with the precision of men who had done this before. Thick wires were connected, small canisters set in place, and within moments the machine was rigged with explosives. The silence of the street was broken by a muffled hiss as the detonator clicked into place. Then came the blast. A deafening roar ripped through the night, echoing down the street like a thunderclap. Glass shattered instantly, spraying shards across the pavement. Windows in nearby homes rattled, sending residents bolt upright in their beds. The shop's metal shutter buckled outward, smoke billowed into the air, and chunks of brickwork crumbled onto the ground. What had been a still, uneventful corner of the city just seconds earlier was now a scene of chaos and destruction. Inside the wreckage, flames licked at the edges of shelves, alarms wailed, and dust filled the air. But the gang moved without hesitation. They rushed through the debris, dragging out the ATM's mangled remains. One of them ripped open the twisted steel casing, pulling out bundles of cash still bound in straps. The money was shoved into holdalls with frantic speed, each second feeling like an hour as the noise of the explosion threatened to draw attention. Their gloves smeared with soot, their clothes dusted with fragments of concrete, the men sprinted back to the Audi. The driver slammed the accelerator and the car roared back into the night, disappearing within seconds. By the time residents peered out of their windows, all they could see was smoke rising from the shop front, the glow of flames, and the faint echo of tires screeching away. A few brave locals rushed outside, staring at the wreckage in disbelief. For them, the noise and destruction had come out of nowhere. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, but the gang had already mellowed into the darkness, leaving only chaos behind. What no one realized in that moment was that this was not a one-off. It was only the start of a series of violent raids that would spread fear across Manchester. In the days that followed, the aftermath of the first attack was all anyone in the area could talk about. Shopkeepers stood outside the wrecked convenience store, shaking their heads at the damage. Windows were boarded up, the entrance sealed, and charred bricks still bore the marks of the blast. Residents whispered about how easily the gang had struck and how quickly they had vanished. People wondered if the store had been targeted at random or if it was part of something larger. It did not take long for the answer to reveal itself. Only a week later, another ATM exploded in the early hours, this time at a petrol station on the edge of town. The blast was so strong that passing drivers thought they had heard a car backfire, only to find smoke rising when they looked in their mirrors. The attackers used the same tactics: a stolen car, masked men, explosives, and a rapid escape. Within minutes they were gone, leaving behind devastation and stunned onlookers. The similarities were undeniable. A pattern was forming, and the city began to realize that Manchester had become the hunting ground for a professional, highly organized gang. Soon, the strikes spread wider. From corner shops to supermarkets, no ATM felt safe. Each raid was carried out with ruthless efficiency, never lasting more than a few minutes. The gang seemed fearless, striking in busy districts as well as quiet suburbs. They rammed cars through shopfronts, creating makeshift entrances before planting their explosives. The explosions were so precise that investigators believed someone in the group had serious technical knowledge. For shop owners, the losses were devastating. Not only was the cash stolen, but their businesses were left in ruins, sometimes too damaged to reopen. Word of the attacks traveled fast. Local news ran nightly reports, showing scorched storefronts and shaken residents who spoke of being jolted awake by blasts that sounded like bombs. The public grew nervous, unsure where the next strike would be. Some people avoided shops with ATMs altogether, while others urged business owners to remove machines before they became targets. Fear seeped into daily life, and the gang's reputation only grew stronger. They were no longer seen as simple thieves, but as a crew who brought chaos and destruction with them. The police, meanwhile, struggled to keep up. Every time officers arrived, they found the same scene: blown-out walls, scattered debris, and terrified shopkeepers. The criminals left behind no fingerprints, no clear CCTV images, and no reliable witnesses. Their stolen vehicles were abandoned and torched in secluded areas, leaving little for forensics to examine. It was as if the gang vanished into thin air after every job. The sense of invincibility that surrounded them fed into the fear already gripping Manchester. With each new attack, the amount of cash stolen rose higher, and so did the gang's confidence. What had started as one shocking incident was now becoming a wave of destruction that the authorities seemed powerless to stop. Manchester had become the stage for a series of brazen robberies that were only growing in scale and violence, and everyone knew the worst was yet to come. What set these criminals apart from others before them was not just the speed of their operations or the stolen cars they left behind in flames, but the brutal power of their chosen method. They relied on explosives, a weapon rarely seen in street-level crime, and they used them with chilling precision. Unlike gangs who relied on crowbars, grinders, or gas canisters, this crew planted small but devastating charges directly inside the cash dispensers. When detonated, the blasts forced the machines apart from within, blowing out the safe compartments and spilling bundles of cash that would otherwise have been impossible to reach. It was a technique that required knowledge, patience, and a level of daring that most criminals did not possess. The damage caused by their signature method was catastrophic. Shopfronts were torn apart, ceilings collapsed, and walls split open as if struck by artillery. Local residents began to describe the scenes as resembling war zones, rather than simple burglaries. Fires often broke out in the aftermath, sparked by the heat of the blasts and fueled by the debris of shops packed with everyday goods. Firefighters who arrived at the scenes often had to battle both flames and falling masonry, all while police cordons grew tighter around crowds of onlookers. Investigators noticed the consistency of the explosions. They were not random or sloppy, but carefully controlled, designed to maximize the destruction of the ATM while limiting the time the gang needed to extract the money. Security experts suggested that someone in the group might have had military training or experience with demolition work. Others believed the knowledge had been passed down from criminals in mainland Europe, where similar ATM explosions had been reported in recent years. Whatever the source, the technique was rare in the UK, and its sudden appearance in Manchester shocked authorities. For shopkeepers, the aftermath was more than just financial loss. Businesses that had taken years to build were reduced to rubble overnight. Insurance claims dragged on, customers went elsewhere, and many shop owners feared reopening, knowing they could be hit again. Families living above or near these shops described nights filled with anxiety, never knowing if the next thunderous blast would happen on their street. Parents kept children away from corner stores that had once been safe community hubs, and many locals began to feel like prisoners in their own neighborhoods. The gang seemed to thrive on the fear they created. Each explosion carried a message. They could strike anywhere, at any time, and nothing would stop them. Every new report on the evening news only added to their growing reputation. To some, they became a shadowy legend whispered about in pubs and on street corners. To others, They were a nightmare that turned ordinary shops into targets of violent destruction. What was once just about stealing money had now become an act of intimidation, where the sight of a ruined building became their calling card. The police could no longer treat these incidents as simple robberies. The use of explosives pushed the crimes into a darker category, one that blurred the line between theft and terrorism. Each fresh blast placed more pressure on detectives, who were now under orders to stop the gang before the city descended further into chaos. But as the criminals perfected their methods, they also grew bolder, and the fear they left behind spread faster than the smoke from their explosions. The mounting chaos placed enormous strain on Manchester's police force. Each new explosion brought fresh headlines, fresh anger from residents, and fresh pressure from city leaders demanding results. Detectives knew they were not dealing with petty criminals. These were professionals who worked with military-style precision and vanished like ghosts. Patrol officers were doubled during the night shifts. Helicopters were deployed in the skies, and undercover cars prowled the streets near cash machines. Yet no matter how many resources were poured into the effort, the gang always seemed one step ahead. Officers pieced together every scrap of evidence they could. Burnt-out shells of stolen Audis and BMWs were towed from lonely laybys and abandoned industrial estates. Forensics teams combed through the wrecks, looking for fingerprints or DNA, but the gang were meticulous. They wore gloves, wiped down every surface, and doused the cars with petrol before setting them alight. By the time police arrived, the vehicles were nothing more than twisted, blackened metal, giving investigators almost nothing to work with. The few fragments that survived told little about the men who had driven them. CCTV footage offered no clearer answers. The gang moved fast and wore masks, hoods, and gloves. On the grainy cameras, they appeared only as shadows, faceless figures darting in and out of the smoke. Some clips showed the stolen cars, but plates were false. Lights were dimmed and speeds were too high for clear images. The criminals had studied their environment, knew exactly where cameras were positioned, and seemed to pick targets carefully to avoid leaving useful footage behind. Meanwhile, the public grew restless. Shopkeepers staged meetings with council leaders, demanding greater protection. Community groups urged residents to remain vigilant, reporting any suspicious movements of cars late at night. Rumors began to swirl, some suggesting the gang had inside information from police scanners, others claiming they had links to organized crime groups from outside the city. The lack of answers created a breeding ground for fear, and every new explosion deepened the sense that the authorities were losing control. Detectives worked around the clock, forming a special task force dedicated solely to catching the culprits. They shared intelligence with police in neighboring counties, hoping to spot a trail. Roadblocks were occasionally set up after attacks, but the gang always disappeared before the net could close. Some officers quietly admitted they admired the precision, even as they despised the devastation left behind. It was clear these men had planned their operation for months, if not years, rehearsing every detail until the strikes became flawless. For the force, it became more than just an investigation. It was a battle for credibility. Each failed attempt stopped the gang chipped away at public confidence. Headlines branded the criminals untouchable, and some residents began to wonder if they would ever be caught. As pressure mounted, detectives knew that one mistake, one overlooked clue, could mean another shop reduced to rubble and another night filled with fear. The city was holding its breath, waiting to see if the police could deliver a breakthrough before the gang struck again. The gang had operated with a sense of invincibility, almost untouchable, until one small miscalculation changed everything. On a foggy morning in a quiet suburb, they attempted another heist, this time targeting a cash machine inside a local newsagent. Their plan had been rehearsed to perfection, or so they believed. The explosive charges were set, the getaway car parked nearby, and the gang readied themselves for a swift escape. But this time something went wrong. The timing of the detonation was off. One of the charges went off a second too early, creating a far larger explosion than intended. The blast shattered windows along the entire row of shops, sending bricks, glass, and metal flying across the street. Smoke and fire engulfed the newsagent, spreading quickly to nearby buildings. The roar of the explosion echoed for blocks, shaking residents awake in their homes and drawing immediate attention from passing motorists. The sheer magnitude of the blast caught the gang off guard. For the first time, their carefully planned routine began to unravel. While two of the men scrambled to drag the cash away, a pub located just across the street captured their movements on CCTV. It was a low-resolution camera, the kind meant only for monitoring customers, but it caught something crucial: a glimpse of a tattoo on one suspect's wrist, and an outline of a distinctive build. These details were subtle, almost imperceptible, but to experienced detectives they were gold. For the first time, law enforcement had a lead that went beyond burned-out cars and shattered ATMs. The gang fled the scene in a stolen Audi, but the explosion had drawn attention in a way they had not anticipated. Residents called the emergency services immediately, and by the time the car screeched away, police units were already converging on the area. Although the gang managed to vanish into side streets and alleyways, the CCTV footage had captured their movements long enough to give investigators a starting point. It was a small crack in their armor, but it was enough to start building a case. As the dust settled, detectives analyzed the footage frame by frame. The tattoo, partially visible on the suspect's wrist, became a focal point. Forensic analysts enhanced the images, and the outline of the man's body and posture were compared against known criminal profiles. Meanwhile, officers began to cross-reference stolen car reports, explosive materials, and similar heists in the area. Each piece of information started to form a picture of the gang, revealing patterns and habits that had previously gone unnoticed. This mistake, though seemingly minor in the chaos of the explosion, marked a turning point. The gang's confidence had been shaken, and law enforcement finally had a tangible clue to pursue. For the first time it seemed possible that the men behind the ATM terror could be identified and captured. The city of Manchester watched and waited, still wary of further destruction, but with a growing sense that even the most audacious criminals could make errors, and that those errors could eventually lead to justice. The miscalculated blast became a symbol of vulnerability, showing that even the most meticulous criminals were not infallible. It was a reminder that arrogance, no matter how carefully masked by speed and violence, could ultimately be their undoing. The gang had underestimated the smallest details, and in doing so had given the authorities their first real advantage in a battle that had seemed hopeless for months. The gang had operated with a sense of invincibility, almost untouchable, until one small miscalculation changed everything. On a foggy morning in a quiet suburb, they attempted another heist, this time targeting a cash machine inside a local newsagent. Their plan had been rehearsed to perfection, or so they believed. The explosive charges were set, the getaway car parked nearby, and the gang readied themselves for a swift escape. But this time something went wrong. The timing of the detonation was off. One of the charges went off a second too early, creating a far larger explosion than intended. The blast shattered windows along the entire row of shops, sending bricks, glass, and metal flying across the street. Smoke and fire engulfed the newsagent, spreading quickly to nearby buildings. The roar of the explosion echoed for blocks, shaking residents awake in their homes and drawing immediate attention from passing motorists. The sheer magnitude of the blast caught the gang off guard. For the first time, their carefully planned routine began to unravel. While two of the men scrambled to drag the cash away, a pub located just across the street captured their movements on CCTV. It was a low-resolution camera, the kind meant only for monitoring customers, but it caught something crucial: a glimpse of a tattoo on one suspect's wrist, and an outline of a distinctive build. These details were subtle, almost imperceptible, but to experienced detectives, they were gold. For the first time, law enforcement had a lead that went beyond burned-out cars and shattered ATMs. The gang fled the scene in a stolen Audi, but the explosion had drawn attention in a way they had not anticipated. Residents called the emergency services immediately, and by the time the car screeched away, police units were already converging on the area. Although the gang managed to vanish into side streets and alleyways, The CCTV footage had captured their movements long enough to give investigators a starting point. It was a small crack in their armor, but it was enough to start building a case. As the dust settled, detectives analyzed the footage frame by frame. The tattoo, partially visible on the suspect's wrist, became a focal point. Forensic analysts enhanced the images, and the outline of the man's body and posture were compared against known criminal profiles. Meanwhile, officers began to cross-reference stolen car reports, explosive materials, and similar heists in the area. Each piece of information started to form a picture of the gang, revealing patterns and habits that had previously gone unnoticed. This mistake, though seemingly minor in the chaos of the explosion, marked a turning point. The gang's confidence had been shaken, and law enforcement finally had a tangible clue to pursue. For the first time, it seemed possible that the men behind the ATM terror could be identified and captured. The city of Manchester watched and waited, still wary of further destruction, but with a growing sense that even the most audacious criminals could make errors, and that those errors could eventually lead to justice. The miscalculated blast became a symbol of vulnerability, showing that even the most meticulous criminals were not infallible. It was a reminder that arrogance, no matter how carefully masked by speed and violence, could ultimately be their undoing. The gang had underestimated the smallest details, and in doing so had given the authorities their first real advantage in a battle that had seemed hopeless for months. The investigation into the gang's operations took a new turn after the mistaken explosion. Detectives realized that to catch the criminals they needed to understand the full network behind the heists, not just the men directly carrying out the robberies. The stolen vehicles had always been a weak point for the gang, leaving clues that could be traced back through a complex chain of chop shops and fences. Investigators focused on this network, knowing that cracking it could unravel the gang's entire operation. For weeks, officers followed leads, linking stolen Audis, BMWs, and even a few high-end Volkswagens back to small, inconspicuous garages on the outskirts of Manchester. These workshops appeared legitimate from the street, but hidden inside were vehicles stripped of parts, engines disassembled, and countless stolen plates stacked in drawers. Mechanics moved with precision and speed, often working late into the night. It became clear that the gang relied heavily on these contacts to supply the vehicles used in their raids, knowing the cars could later be destroyed to remove evidence. Surveillance teams spent long nights watching the workshops. Cameras captured deliveries of new vehicles and the occasional hurried transfer of keys to men wearing hooded sweatshirts and masks. One night, officers spotted a familiar figure from the pub's CCTV, the man with the tattoo, receiving keys from a mechanic and slipping away into the darkness. Though still masked, his gait and build matched the earlier footage, confirming that the gang's network was being mapped successfully. Detectives realized that they were closing in step by step on the people supplying the tools of destruction. The stolen car trail also revealed the gang's meticulous planning. Vehicles were rarely used more than once, and each car was chosen for specific jobs. Some were quick and agile for rapid getaways, while others were heavy and strong enough to ram through reinforced shopfronts. By analyzing these patterns, investigators could predict the types of vehicles likely to appear at future attacks. This intelligence allowed the police to begin deploying covert units near potential targets, hoping to intercept the gang before they could strike again. While the focus was on vehicles, forensic teams continued to gather evidence from the crime scenes themselves. Fragments of explosives, traces of accelerant, and tiny fibers from clothing provided more pieces of the puzzle. Combined with surveillance of the stolen car network, authorities began constructing detailed profiles of the gang members, including possible roles, habits, and connections to other criminal organizations. Each day brought new insight into how the group operated, from the planning stages to the execution of each violent theft. The breakthrough in tracking the stolen vehicles reinvigorated the investigation. For months, the gang had seemed untouchable, moving with confidence and leaving chaos in their wake. Now, with the network mapped and a suspect identified, the police had a fighting chance to intercept them. The mechanics and chop shops became key targets, not just for arrests, but for intelligence gathering that could finally expose the full scope of the gang's activities. For Manchester, this meant hope. The city had lived in fear for weeks, with every ATM a potential target and every quiet street hiding danger. But the detectives' persistence and careful tracking of stolen vehicles brought the first real sense of control. It was a reminder that even the most organized and violent criminals depended on networks, and networks could be traced, observed, and eventually dismantled. The gang's web of stolen cars was no longer invisible, and with each connection uncovered, the net around them tightened. Despite the increasing pressure from police, the gang remained determined to carry out one final, high-stakes heist. They had spent weeks planning it, choosing a rural petrol station on the outskirts of Manchester, far from the crowded city streets. The location was ideal, isolated, lightly monitored, and stocked with a full weekend delivery of cash. For the gang, this was meant to be their last score before disappearing for good, a final haul to cement their reputation and line their pockets. But their overconfidence would prove to be their downfall. The night of the heist was eerily quiet. Mist hung low over the fields surrounding the petrol station. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. The gang arrived in a stolen Audi, its engine whisper quiet. Plates changed, and interior stripped of any identifying features. Masks were pulled over faces, gloves secured, and the explosive devices checked and double-checked. Every member of the crew knew the plan. Ram the car through the storefront, plant the explosives, grab the cash, and escape before anyone could respond. They had rehearsed it countless times in abandoned warehouses, confident that no one could stop them. As they approached the ATM, a police task force, tipped off by intelligence gathered from stolen car networks and surveillance of the gang's previous operations, was already in position. Officers had predicted the target based on patterns of past raids and the gang's known preferences. Hidden in the shadows, armed units waited for the moment the gang would make their move. The criminals, unaware of the trap, began their familiar routine, raking into the petrol station with practiced precision. The first explosion ripped through the building as planned, but the sirens that followed immediately changed everything. Police officers emerged from cover, surrounding the gang on multiple sides. Panic set in. Two of the men sprinted across the surrounding fields, abandoning their carefully prepared getaway route. One tried to climb into the car and make a last-minute escape, only to crash it into a ditch, the vehicle skidding into the mud. The remaining member of the crew, trapped inside the station with the cash and smoke swirling around him, was captured hiding in a nearby barn, dazed and defeated. It was the culmination of months of investigation and painstaking surveillance. The police had used every advantage gained from the gang's prior mistakes and their reliance on stolen cars to predict the final heist. By intercepting them in the act, authorities not only stopped the theft, but also secured enough evidence to link the gang to all previous ATM explosions. Forensic teams collected explosives, fibers, fingerprints, and digital records that would become the backbone of the case against them. The failed last job marked the end of the gang's reign of terror. The £60,000 they had amassed over months of raids was rendered insignificant compared to the destruction they had caused and the fear they had spread throughout Manchester. With arrests made and evidence in hand, the authorities were finally able to bring some measure of closure to the residents who had lived in constant fear of the next explosion. The final heist proved that even the most calculated criminals could falter. Overconfidence, reliance on routine, underestimating the persistence of law enforcement became their undoing. In a matter of hours, a group that had seemed untouchable was dismantled, proving that meticulous planning and courage from the authorities could outmatch even the most daring and violent criminal enterprise. The streets of Manchester, once shrouded in fear, began to breathe easier, knowing the gang had finally been stopped. The capture of the gang marked the end of a terrifying chapter in Manchester's history, but the aftermath was far from simple. The £60,000 they had stolen was only part of the story. The true cost of their crimes lay in the devastation they left behind. Boarded-up shops, shattered windows, scorched interiors, and communities living in fear for weeks on end. Business owners struggled to rebuild, some never reopening, and insurance claims dragged on for months. The city was left to reckon not just with financial loss, but with a shaken sense of security that had been eroded by months of brazen attacks. Court cases began, drawing attention from national media. Prosecutors presented the gang's history, from the first explosion to the final failed heist, laying bare the meticulous planning, stolen vehicles, and homemade explosives that had terrorized the city. Evidence collected from burnt-out cars, CCTV footage, and the final petrol station interception painted a damning picture of a criminal enterprise that was both sophisticated and ruthless. Witnesses, forensic experts, and police officers testified about the destruction and fear caused by the gang, ensuring that their impact was fully understood in court. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the gang had been motivated by more than simple financial gain. Their use of explosives and stolen vehicles, combined with the speed and precision of their operations, had transformed theft into an act of intimidation. Each heist sent a message, not just to authorities, but to the public, that they could strike anywhere, at any time, and vanish without consequence. This psychological element of their crimes made them uniquely dangerous, and it was emphasized repeatedly during the trial. Sentences were handed down, long and severe, reflecting the scale and severity of the crimes. Prison terms stretched over decades, ensuring that the key members of the gang would be removed from society for good. For the residents and business owners of Manchester, these sentences were a relief, but they were also a reminder of how vulnerable ordinary communities could be to violence when criminals acted with precision and audacity. The case also prompted broader discussions about security, law enforcement, and community resilience. Police departments reviewed their approaches to organized crime, particularly the use of explosives in urban areas, and worked to improve coordination between units tracking stolen vehicles, monitoring suspicious behavior, and investigating high-risk targets. Shopkeepers invested in stronger security measures, including reinforced ATMs, alarm systems, and better lighting, determined to prevent a repeat of the terror they had endured. For Manchester itself, the story of the £60,000 ATM gang became more than a tale of crime. It became a cautionary lesson. It highlighted how greed and violence, combined with technical knowledge, could disrupt ordinary life in an instant. It showed the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the relentless work of law enforcement. And most importantly, it reminded the city that even in the face of fear and chaos, justice could prevail. Months after the gang's capture, the streets slowly returned to normal. Shops reopened, neighborhoods regained a sense of calm, and residents resumed their routines without the constant dread of explosions. The £60,000 had been taken, but the gang's reign of terror had ended. Manchester had endured, adapted and learned, proving that even the most dangerous criminals could ultimately be held accountable, and that fear, no matter how pervasive, could be replaced by resilience and justice.